So I want to start with the full disclosure that this morning I'm road testing this topic. I've become increasingly preoccupied with the topic of attention, or really attention and distraction. And there's so much to explore and unpack with this topic. And I'm really grateful that I have this chance to begin reflecting on this with you. And I really welcome what you might have to say about this. And I will try my best to leave some time at the end for your own comments, questions, reflections. So for me, there are several threads that have converged in the consideration of this topic of attention. A little personal history. The increasing claims on my attention that devices and digital media make were already obvious to me before I became a parent nearly 12 years ago. In my own case, as a lifelong reader, and as a professional reader, in fact, as an editor, translator, years ago, it was already becoming obvious how difficult it was getting for me to read a book cover to cover without having my attention diverted somewhere else. Now, even though for me, having my attention diverted somewhere else typically meant having it diverted towards something else to read online, um, it was becoming harder and harder to ignore that my attention span appeared to be diminishing. And the quality of my attention was becoming a little manic, like it needed to constantly jump from one thing to another. After I became a parent, then it felt like I really had a front row seat to how effectively and insidiously devices and digital media can monopolize and fragment our attention. When you're scrolling or clicking or swiping or smashing that like button yourself, there's almost a hypnotic effect that it has. That's really, I think, an experience of operating on autopilot. Personally, what I've discovered as a parent is that it's easier for me to recognize that effect when I'm watching my 11-year-old swipe from one YouTube clip to another. And now it's become really hard for me not to notice, for example, just how often the people I encounter in public are staring down at their devices. And to be totally honest with you, it's really hard for me not to notice how easy it is for me to say to my son Luca in the evening, off the device, while I'm still staring at my own. You may be familiar with this. I remember learning some years ago that child development can be described in terms of stages of play. And in the stages of play, the stage of what they call side by side or parallel play, like when two children are playing together but not really together, like they're together but they're each occupied in their own way, that stage comes before the stage of what they call face to face or cooperative play, where they really are playing together. So, how often have you found yourself in a restaurant or a coffee shop and noticed that a table of two or three or four people who are out together are all sitting at a table individually staring at their own phone, caught up in whatever TikTok or Instagram videos they're watching or busy taking selfies? I mean, maybe you do this too. I mean, I certainly do from time to time if I'm not intentional about not doing it. But now when I see other people do this, and I see this all the time, it immediately makes me wonder if these adults have regressed from playing face to face to playing side by side. And that is a little unsettling for me. It really gives me pause. That's one thread. Another thread is that in early December of last year, several weeks after the end of another fraught election, I was sitting through a Sunday sermon at the Unitarian Society of Santa Barbara that was delivered by the lead minister there, the Reverend Julia Hamilton. And her sermon that morning was about digital media. And in particular, it was about the culture of digital engagement and the hold that these technologies have on us personally and socially, culturally and politically. She was talking, in other words, about what we now commonly hear called the attention economy. And she said something that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. It's the only thing I remember from that sermon, actually. And at the time, I even pulled out my phone, not unironically, and made a note of what she said, which was pay attention to what you pay attention to. Pay attention to what you pay attention to. I remember thinking at the time, the Buddha might have said that. It's brilliant to me. It's like a pith instruction for the digital age. Pay attention to what you pay attention to. How often have you found yourself drifting from page to page, meme to meme, clip to clip, far afield from whatever prompted you to pull your device out to begin with? Do you ever find yourself, in other words, attending to your device without paying very close attention at all to what you're actually paying attention to with it? Do you ever find with your device that your attention has been carried away? So that advice from the Reverend Julia, pay attention to what you pay attention to, eventually reminded me of another note that I have in my phone. This one, a quote from William James, who's the father of American psychology. He once wrote, "The faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will." When I pay attention to what I pay attention to, what I often find is that my attention is constantly being captured and diverted from this to that to this over and over again. Now, in her sermon, the Reverend Julia Hamilton was talking about how our attention has become like a currency, and how with every click, what we're doing, in fact, is potentially subsidizing forces of distraction and maybe even darkness, to be really frank. And because our attention is now a currency, there are numerous hands out asking for it, demanding it even. It's as if our consciousness has become a near constant commercial. And that means that our attention has been deliberately fragmented to accommodate as many ads as possible. The final thread for me that inspired reflection on this topic of attention, the journalist Chris Hayes has written a book. I'm not sure if it's been published yet, to be honest, about the attention economy. And several months ago, he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about the topic. And reading that op-ed for me was like that experience of hearing a song that you can't place, but that you definitely know you've heard before. Because although he didn't in this op-ed mention the Buddha, he does mention mindfulness. He doesn't mention the Buddha. To me, it seemed that what he essentially did was rediscover some of what the Buddha first taught about what we call suffering in Buddhism and about craving and the power of the mind. Because in this op-ed, he describes what he calls a form of attention capitalism. And he points out how, in the form of digital technology, we've constructed a very sophisticated apparatus for producing boredom and then the entertainment to fill it in endlessly repeating loops. He calls boredom the silent engine of modern life, and attention, that is where we put our conscious thoughts in any given moment, he calls the substance of life, and says that what we now find ourselves doing is repeatedly and often unconsciously being seduced into giving away our attention for free. So I want to share two quotes from that op-ed. We tend to associate the experience of boredom with childhood, zoning out in class, long summer days at home with nothing to do. But that's just because as soon as we get old enough to control our time, we do everything possible to make sure we never experience boredom. And the second quote, and today we find ourselves surrounded by endless sources of diversion, and yet none of it ever quite enough to truly escape the terror of boredom. Now, to take that as a point of departure, what are those endless sources of diversion really? Digital media is designed to maximize our engagement with it, right? And as it turns out, nothing keeps us clicking or swiping or scrolling like our old friends' desire, anger, and fear. So much of the content that we consume, especially the content that we wind up compulsively consuming, is content that's been almost surgically designed to stimulate our desire, our anger, or our fear. I mean, ways that we're often barely aware of if we're not trying to make a conscious effort to be mindful. That is, if we're not paying attention to what we're paying attention to. We might say that to the extent that the media we consume is designed to deliver these little hits of dopamine, in the same way that alcohol, drugs, gambling, sex, shopping, whatever it is, deliver little hits of dopamine, then the engine of digital media is really the careful cultivation and manipulation of craving. It's samsara on steroids. And it's just as Chris Hayes says about being surrounded by endless sources of diversion, without any of it ever being enough for us in the end to truly escape the terror of boredom. Digital media cultivates our craving to keep us engaged. But precisely for that reason, it can never satisfy that craving. The cycle of engagement perpetuates itself by constantly renewing the craving that powers it, which means never fully or finally satisfying that craving. Now, you can probably see the punchline coming a mile away. Does this sound familiar? This is samsara on steroids. This might be a thumbnail sketch of what the Buddha taught. In the Four Noble Truths, the very first teaching that the Buddha gave after his awakening, he said that we find ourselves existentially beset in the end by discontent, dissatisfaction, the sense that something is somehow missing, whatever constrains or binds the heart and mind, makes it restless, what he called suffering. He said that all of that is rooted in and ultimately caused by states of clinging or greed, aversion, which is a form of inverted clinging, and delusion, the misperception that makes those states of clinging possible. And when we experience that quote unquote suffering and the craving and delusion that power it in endlessly repeating loops, that we will continue to experience that kind of dissatisfaction so long as we continue to experience the craving that powers it, and that this cycle is potentially endless. That is what samsara means, in fact, literally is a cycle, potentially endless cycle or pattern. And it repeats itself unless and until we can step outside of it or undo those loops by means of the path, which means, or which begins by learning to see those patterns clearly, by learning to pay attention to what's really at work in our experience. So we might say that the entirety of the Buddha's teaching in one way or another, is about attention, about what we do with our minds, or more to the point, about what we choose to do with our minds. That is how we occupy them, how we direct them. Because if we needed an elevator pitch for Buddhist practice, it might go something like this. The mind is primary, and the mind can be cultivated. We can learn to exercise agency over our minds. And although one of the most common ways in which mindfulness is understood today is in terms of what's often called like choiceless awareness or non-judgmental awareness, that is an awareness that kind of remains open to anything and everything that arises in its field. In fact, a very important part of Buddhist practice involves making choices about what to do with or where to direct your awareness. And that means that it's often important to know when to direct your attention elsewhere. So Buddhist practice is paying attention to what you pay attention to and learning how to make choices about what you do with your attention, what you give your attention to. Just being mindful turns out to not always be a kindness to yourself. And it turns out that it isn't always the best practice, or at the very least, it isn't the only practice. Often it's just the beginning of the practice. It's often just the basis on which we then go on to make choices about where and how to direct our attention. So I want to give you one example of this, because again, there's a great deal that we could say about understanding Buddhist practice in this particular way. That is, in terms of learning what to pay attention to and what not to pay attention to, learning to approach your attention as the kind of thing that you can make choices about. So in traditional presentations, and especially in, for example, in Theravada Buddhism, which is where the mindfulness movement or insight meditation comes from, and in general Mahayana Buddhism, there are lists of the prerequisites for successful practice or prerequisites for any kind of serious meditation practice. And there are several elements that all of those lists have in common. One of them is what's called in Sanskrit Indriya Sambhara. For those of you on Zoom, I can put that in the chat just if you're curious. Indriya Sambhara. Now, this word is more often than not translated into English as restraint of the senses, which sounds very monastic. And in fact, Indriya Samvara, restraint of the senses, quote unquote, is considered one of the four kinds of ethical behavior or discipline that monks and nuns should cultivate. But it's also generally encouraged in all serious meditators as a prerequisite for practice. Now, what Indriya Samvara, or restraint of the senses, means is not that you should block out sensory experience. It doesn't mean that you should shut your eyes or plug your ears or avoid eating or anything like that. Rather, it means that you should restrain your senses by first being mindful in the way that we mentioned of whatever it is that you experience through your senses. So whatever it is that you see or hear or smell or touch, whatever comes into your mind, you should first be mindful of what that is. And then you should slowly develop the ability to notice when there are features in that experience that may, whether you want them to or not, elicit in you defilements or afflictions like greed or clinging or aversion or jealousy or delusion, whatever it happens to be. So, yes, it is important first to be mindful of whatever it is that you experience. But if what you experience in those objects of your senses, and remember the mind is a sense here too, is something that might lead you down the path of one of the defilements, then you learn to direct your attention elsewhere. So that's the kind of restraint that is meant here. And the word samvara, which gets translated as restraint, can also mean choice. So what this practice is a practice of learning to develop the ability to make choices about where you direct your attention. So what that might mean, for example, is that if you encounter something in your experience that is liable to cause in you something like clinging or craving or aversion, then you do not need, as a part of the practice, to simply remain mindful of it, but you ought to direct your attention elsewhere. That is, you you ought to make choices about when to pay attention and when not to pay attention to to that particular object. So it doesn't, again, involve blocking out so much. It just involves, as a kindness to yourself, learning to not pay attention when paying attention is something that isn't healthy for you.